Thanks everybody for coming. Today we have our guest speaker is Gregorio Alonso from the University of Leeds. Gregorio has been there for 7 years, previously in King's College, and he defended a thesis in Spain, in La Autónoma de Madrid, on the church throughout the 19th century. And has written extensively about church and state relations in Spain and increasingly about Latin America as well. And he's going to tell us about his new project that is increasingly more Latin American. Always Britain and Spain, and now Britain and Latin America as well. Spain and Latin America. So with no further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Gregorio today.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Natalia Sobrevilla, Paulo, and the organizers of the seminar series for their kind invitation to share with you some preliminary thoughts on the longer work in progress on the European dimensions and connections of the Latin American independence process. This is where I'm working now. So tonight we're going to talk about the Imperial rivalries, insurgents and spies, Britain and Spain during the Latin American independence. Well, first of all, I would like to point out that the reason why there were so many Latin Americans in London since the late decades of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century was in search for support of the Majesty in order to provide official recognition of the independence process, but also very material interest. The idea of El Dorado seemed to be pretty resilient, and it was there. We will look into a little bit of that later on. So this talk is structured in 3 sections, and I will read out. Sorry, as I say, work in progress. 3 sections. The focus will firstly be put on the historiographical need to include the Iberian world to further develop, deepen and widen our understanding of Atlantic history. The so-called Age of Independence and its immediate aftermath are proving to be a particularly fruitful time span to carry out such an enterprise. Secondly, I will use one case study involving spies and conspirators with sound Atlantic trajectories to highlight the potential usefulness of such a extended approach to examine the mutual influences between the two shores of the Atlantic. The aim, therefore, is to provide some general reflections on the role of Anglo-Spanish mediation, collaboration and competition in the unfolding of the Latin American independence process. Finally, I will conclude by addressing some relevant historiographical and methodological questions related to this enhanced approach, which aims to boost our perceived knowledge of the unfolding Atlantic connections in the late colonial and early independence periods. Drawing on the works of authors such as Jeremy Alderman, Antonio Anino, Roberto Breña, Jorge García Cañizares Guerra, James Dunkley, Scott Eastman, Alejandro Gómez, François Xavier Guerra, Daniel Gutiérrez Ardila, John Lynch, Gabriel Paquet, José María Portillo, Karen Racine and Jane Sanders, this paper will argue that far more historiographical work is necessary to fully grasp the global dimensions of the so-called Atlantic revolutions of the late 18th century and the early 19th century. Their contributions have largely and convincingly shown that there were different levels of interaction between the metropoles and the colonies. More importantly, they have shown that influences were reciprocal and not unidirectional. The reverberations of shared concerns and challenges didn't always follow Columbus' route, but in so many times accompanied the jet stream from the Americas to good old Europe. Latin America, thus, was not a passive and deserted laboratory for enlightened reformist or liberal ideas, or an empty field plenty of underexploited raw materials waiting for modern utilitarian and liberal economic experimentation. On the contrary, the New World was new in more than one sense, and its ethnic diversity, its elitist search for modernization and rationalization, and its institutional setup mirror colonial dreams and ambitions as much as they prefigure post-colonial uncertainties and anxieties in a rather modern fashion. Both England and Spain experienced the loss of most of their American continental territories during these Atlantic revolutions. both composite monarchies, to borrow the term coined in 1992 by John Eliot, bitterly suffered the pressing need for imperial reform in the face of growing challenges in the last decades of the 18th century, as highlighted by Gabe Paquette. The French Revolution and the emergence of the Napoleonic Empire, as well as the subsequent political crisis of global dimensions they brought about, set the scenario of the Imperial rivalries that give title to my talk today. The local understanding of freedom in the post-independence period in Latin America not only drew on the local appropriation and reformulation of the basic tenets of European and Anglo-Saxon enlightened thought, or the legacy of the French revolutionary policies. In addition to those clear and deeply felt influences, they were equally informed by long-lasting adaptations of the meanings of justice and sovereignty, as well as collective and individual rights and privileges as tools for resistance against absolutist royal despotism. The constitutional incarnation of such materials acquired a distinct flavor which reflected the power balance between the different driving forces of the independence process and the perceived meanings of emancipation for the local elites and communities. Therefore, El Foro de Indios, late scholastic trends of political thought as shown by Carlos Stoetzer, and traditional Castilian jurisdictional sharing of power, as Bartolomé Clavero and José María Portillo have convincingly shown, merged indeed with French liberalism, Anglo-Saxon constitutionalism, political economy and utilitarian thought in an attempt to forefront and preserve the values of those republics of the possible, to use Centeno and Ferraro's stance. The leadership of the movements felt mostly, but not exclusively, as shown by Marisa Lasso, on the shoulders of Creole elites educated in Europe. From the 1780s onwards, men like El Precursor Miranda, masterly studied by Karen Racine, El Libertador Bolívar, Rivadavia, Rocafuerte, and Fray Servando Teresa de Mier have had the opportunity to visit the main cities in the old continent and study in the most prestigious educational institutions. In their stays in London, Madrid, Paris, and Rome, their political imagination took new directions, which pointed to the achievement of autonomy and even independence from colonial rule. They didn't only get in touch with the local cultural and political elites, but they also established personal links with some economic agents with vested interest in their homelands. Thus, London bankers and commercial pundits, Bordeaux slave traders, and Parisian businessmen did also play an active role in the emergence of the pro-independence networks that will be paramount for political developments in Latin America in the late colonial period. Unfortunately, recent works in this area of inquiry have insufficiently relied on the findings of Guadalupe Jiménez Bodinac's monograph on Britain and Mexican independence, where she broke new grounds for research. As for the British material and ideological interest in the Latin American region have been understudied. This is the case for the otherwise suggestive and much needed overview edited volume of the colonial legacies in Latin America by Jeremy Alderman. More recently, Marcelo Somarribia has also shed new light on the relationship between Britain, Argentina and Peru during the Wars of Independence, and accurately explore the long negotiations between the agents of the new republics and British banks and commercial firms. I will say something more about that in the conclusions. As I will try to highlight now in the second section of this talk, the overlapping political, economic and ideological dimensions of Atlantic interactions between the British and the Iberian Atlantic were reshaped in this ultimate stage of long-lasting imperial rivalries. This can be traced in an innovative manner by tracking the individual experiences of political agents who operated in the Atlantic both for and against Latin American independence. The inclusion of the underused primary materials of the Spanish Archivo Histórico Nacional, along with the materials kept in Madrid Biblioteca Nacional, the British Library and the English National Archives in Kew, shows its potential in a renewed historiographical reconstruction of this imperial rivalry. I will start by making reference to a double agent who was operational in Rome, London, and Madrid in the late 1810s, and then turn attention to two cases which involve two former heroes of the Peninsular Wars, who then decided to join forces with the Latin American Creoles, who led the independence process of Mexico and Colombia. In January 1818, the Spanish subject Ángel Ramón Martí visited the neighboring area of Belgravia. His final destination was Chessel Place, the palace where the Spanish embassy was set, and he requested to talk to the ambassador, the Duke of San Carlos. Martí told the diplomat in charge that he had been repressed after the restoration of absolutism in Spain in 1814. His crimes against the crown, he stated, were very minor, and deprived of the minimum living sources and missing his family and fatherland, requested a passport to go back to Spain. However, the Duke of San Carlos started interrogating him. Martí confessed having worked as a stenographer of the Cádiz Cortes in 1810 and as a journalist for the liberal newspaper Diario de Mallorca in the Balearic Islands. He showed his disposition to do whatever it took to achieve his passport, and San Carlos duly tried to find out which connections he had with both the Spanish and the Latin American small communities developing in London. Martí told the ambassador that he had fled Mallorca as an exile after Ferdinand's return to Spain in late 1813, and then went to Rome. It was by then that he met fellow liberal exiles, both Spanish and Latin American, and started his personal relationship with those exile circles. He had allegedly arrived in London in 1817, so the year before, and had met a number of political exiles in this city. At this point, San Carlos ordered him to join a revolutionary expedition due to cross the Atlantic and help the Latin American insurgents. In particular, Martí should enter the circle of the former army officer Mariano Renovales, who is the protagonist of the first case study I would like to share with you this evening. Who was Mariano Renovales, the man who deserves so much attention of the absolutist government? Born in Arcentales, Biscay, in 1774, Renovales was a war hero of the Peninsular War. An officer of the Royal Army, he got in touch with the British for the first time in Buenos Aires in 1806. He took some preeminence in the defense of Buenos Aires during the English invasion of the River Plate led by William Carl Beresford. He closely collaborated with the rich trader, diplomat, and Prime Minister to be, President to be, the Argentine patriot Juan Martín de Pueyrredón in the Battle of Perdriel on the First War in August 1806. When Pueyrredón was sent to Madrid as a member of the local government of Buenos Aires, Renovales took over his role and was promoted to Sergeant General of the Hussars, managing the resistance movements against the British troops. However, the following year, he was also called back to the peninsula and arrived in Bilbao in 1807. When the French army crossed the Pyrenees in the winter of that year, Renovales had moved to Aragon as lieutenant colonel, and he would also play a leading role in the two defensive battles in Zaragoza against the invading troops in 1809. Since these early years, he showed his preference for revolutionary ideas. Both Renovales and the second guy I would like to talk about, Javier Mina, have found in Manuel de Ortuño Martínez their historian, and he has made a significant contribution to their historiographical recovery as prominent figures of those pro-independence Spanish liberals who gathered in London escaping absolutist repression both in 1814 and then in 1823. Along with them feature better-known political figures such as Álvaro Flores de Estrada, one of the best political economists of his generation and the guru of economic thought for Spanish progressive parties for the decades to come. His Curso de Economía Política became the Bible for leaders such as Calatrava, Istúriz, and Mendizábal, who found inspiration on his pages for carrying out the politics of disentailment of the church's lands in the 1830s. During the 1820s, however, when Flores Estrada was a political exile in London, he carried out on working on economic theory. In fact, in 1826, he published his pamphlet Reflections on the Present Mercantile Distress in Great Britain, where he examined the 1825 crash of the city's stock market and its immediate effects on England's national economy. As far as we are concerned, in this talk today, however, the most relevant book by Flor Estrada saw the light in London in 1811, in his first period in the city. En el examen imparcial de las causas de las desensiones de la América y de los medios de conciliarlas, he put the focus on the restrictive representation granted by the Consejo de Castilla as the main route for discontent in Latin America. As you know, in the power vacuum left by the disappearance of Ferdinand VII in the peninsula, el Consejo de Castilla took control along with the regency. El Consejo de Castilla determined that instead of representing the Indios and the African descent population on equal basis with the European Americans, it would be only the European Americans who would be given the grant to create juntas. Therefore, the unbalanced distribution of power between the two sides of the Atlantic. So it was a very important point that Flor Estrada was making in this examen imparcial. In the long run, the sustained attitude of the king and his policies would make both Mina and Renovales to embrace freedom for both Spanish and Spanish Americans, even if the latter has released a manifesto proclama in Cádiz in July 1810 advocating for the unity of the nation across the Atlantic, as disposed by the Constitution. This proclama was entitled La verdadera libertad e independencia de ambos mundos o El triunfo de las Españas. And I quote, "Will the time arrive when the American Spaniards finally enjoy the true freedom and independence they have sought for so long? Yes, it will arrive, because modern Spain has taken up the arms and is fighting for the true freedom and independence of both worlds. I have sworn not to let them down until this just cause is not completed." End of quote. Renovales, moved by a king patriotism based on the loyalty to the king and the Catholic religion, envisaged liberation under the auspices of the, and I quote, eternal reign of the legitimate and immortal King Ferdinand VII, in conjunction with a fair and immutable constitution. The citizens of the Catholic monarchy would need first to wipe out the French dragons, those monsters of destruction and desolation, who, full of pride and greed, wander around our land seeking for the destruction of humankind. End of quote. So the main source of power, Alsaden's guarantee of success against Napoleon, was the unity of the empire under Ferdinand. The solidarity across the Atlantic of all Hispanic peoples, drawn from common lineage and blood bonds, make Spain great and generous. For Renovales, the French attempts to emancipate the Americas from the motherland had resonated in the public papers for some years, and pointed to the seemingly safest pathway to freedom for the modern world. However, Renovales thought otherwise, and he stated, and I quote, "The American Spaniards, the children of the same motherland, have served a common cause in both hemispheres, and their conduct has generally shown their commitment to such a fair and right principle. The aim of the enemy of the fatherland was to divide Spain, to enfeeble it, to better subjugate and enslave it. As for the Americas, the Basque general thought the effects of independence from Spain would imply that another power would take its place and introduce religious and political division. Once the American escapes Spanish rule, they would be divided and riddled with inner struggles and would be enslaved and ruled by external powers, i.e. Britain. Therefore, he concluded that the unity of the American Spaniards with the Iberian Peninsula constituted a rock of strength and wealth against which all many enemies would crash. But very importantly, that unity would only be based on the loyalty to the throne, but mainly to the Constitution and its laws. Unforeseen future developments, Renovales warned, and I quote, "If a prince dare to interrupt the race for happiness and universal peace based on those laws and the Constitution, he will certainly face in the nation that depends upon whose reign depends a fair resistance against its arbitrariness and whim. Renovales' military achievements and exploits as General-in-Chief of the troops of the north of the peninsula were widely reported in the British press, with a tone of admiration. That was the case of a long article published in 1810 of the Battle of Solsona in Biscay on the 24th of August. According to the Gentleman's Magazine and Historical Chronicle, Renovales led a group who successfully protected the two bridges of the town, the French, and closely collaborated with the English Lieutenant William Carroll. But the magazine stated that this victory is highly creditable to the Spanish army. In 1845, so 3 decades later, Renovales still featured in the so-called Encyclopedia Metropolitana, published in Cambridge. And I quote, it's a long one: "At the foot of the Pyrenees and the lofty rocks under Undari were fought many sanguinary battles, in which the French generally worsted and numbers of prisoners handed over to the tender mercies of the guerrillas. In these encounters, Renovales became a name terrible to the ears of the Frenchmen, who sent on expeditions and the transport of convoys and dispatches. The French commanders in Zaragoza and the neighborhood, finding that they had the worst in this cruel retaliatory system, opened a correspondence with the Spaniard with a view of introducing a milder treatment of both sides. They complained also that Renovales himself had broken his parole and commenced this devastating system of retaliation on his conquerors, forgetting they had themselves been the first to set the example of extermination, hanging up the guerrillas like common robbers and executing or banishing their chiefs. Renovales replied in the following words, which put the case in a clear point of view: "If I fled before you brought me to my dungeon in Pamplona, recollect that you Frenchmen violated the sacred compact made at Zaragoza. I was there, the first whom General Marriott, regardless of the honor and faith, deprived of my horses and equipages. If the infraction of so sacred treaty be lawful in a French general, I see no reason why a Spanish general shouldn't take the opportunity of breaking his simple word as regards not the interests of nations and cities, but one of a single prisoner." There was no answer to a species of logic like this. The victories of Roncal and Anso inspired fresh hope throughout the surrounding districts, and the different partisans formed under the auspices of Renovales, threatening to cut off the very communications of the enemy with their own country, alarmed the chief leaders of the French armies that were engaged in the interior of his army. So this long quote by this encyclopedia, I think, convincingly shows that Renovales was a pretty well-known figure. Well, in 1814, 4 years later, once Ferdinand was restored to his throne, general prediction would prove right, and the king decided to abolish the constitution, shut down the parliament, and declare all the decrees and laws passed at Cortes null and void. A brother-in-arms, Javier Mina's wife, brought in parallel to Renovales. He also fought against the French Imperial troops in the peninsula, and along with his uncle, Francisco Espoz Mina, became a popular icon of the resistance against Napoleon. His main victories in Navarre, leading one of the largest guerrilla corps operating in Spain, gave him fame and international recognition. He was taken prisoner in the vicinities of the Pyrenees, where he fought in 1810, and he spent 4 years in prison. According to Manuel Ortuño, Mina met the Republican officer and anti-Bonapartist Manuel Loguer, who educated him in Republican values. Back in Spain in 1814, he would lead with his uncle Francisco Espoz Mina the first conspiracy to restore institutional rule over the Sama that year. The pronunciamiento, however, failed in Pamplona, the chosen town in Navarre, where both men relied on massive support due to these impressive military victories and brave leadership during the War of Independence. El Empecinado, Villacampa, and these two minas in August visited visited Madrid to be given a reception at the royal palace in recognition to their efforts. However, the May Decree, signed by the king restoring absolutism, the perspective of being degraded, and the haughtiness of Ferdinand made them question their loyalty to the despot. Mina and his uncle then started plotting a coup to restore the 1812 constitution that would be discovered before completion, and both generals would need to cross the Pyrenees in haste to save their lives. However, only 1 year later, in La Coruña, in Galicia, General Juan Díaz Porlier would follow their steps and organize a new insurrection with the support of the local garrison and the Masonic lodges of the city. Porlier, who had been born in Cartagena de Indias in 1788, participated in the naval defeat of Trafalgar against the British and gained popularity due to his brave campaigns in Burgos and Valencia during the Peninsular War, mastering guerrilla warfare techniques with his grenadiers. Unfortunately for these freedom fighters, some members of the troops would be bribed, and Porlier's Napoleons also went uncovered. This time the general didn't have the time to leave Spain, and he was hung in the main square of La Coruña on the 12th of October 1815, shortly after his imprisonment. Unimpressed by this course of events and showing his liberal ideas, Renovales was involved in the so-called Conspiración del Triángulo, which started in 1815. The idea was to either kidnap or assassinate the fallen king and restore the 1812 constitution. Francisco Espoz, Juan Donojú, Luis Lacy, Eugenio da Vinareta, and Francisco Milán del Bosque were the other officers involved in this Conspiración del Triángulo. Their leader this time was Vicente Richard, who was arrested in 1816 and, along with other 3 collaborators, hung in Madrid and then quartered in an exemplary, ritualized and gruesome display of force by monarchical absolutism. When 2 years later Renovales would be denounced and processed for treason, he would be sentenced to death by decapitation and his head to be exposed on one of the royal roadways to deter any new insurrections. However, he was informed and able to flee the country and enter France once again. This time, instead, his career as a conspirator would take an unexpected turn, as he decided to gain the royal pardon by denouncing some Latin American insurgents operating in France. But he decided to move on and establish himself in London, using a false identity as Mariano Lecuna. In this city, he got in touch with the Colombian representatives López Méndez, and on the 13th of December 1817, we find Renovales starting correspondence with Bolívar, who advised him to deal in London with the leader of the Junta de Caracas Committee in England, Luis López Méndez. In his reply, El Libertador showed his happiness to see, and I quote, "Not all Spaniards are our enemies, and Spain takes pride in having raised in its bosom generous and sublime spirits." However, unlike Mina, Renovales acted as a double agent, and the fact that his brother Tomás had plotted against Bolívar in the famous Battle of Rincón de los Toros, where the lives of 700 Colombian insurgent soldiers were lost, didn't help him to gain Bolívar's trust. At the same time, similar political conspiracies to restore liberal rule went on in some other countries across the European continent with similar lack of success. Moreover, the global dimension of the Imperial crisis plaguing Spanish politics were duly highlighted by the French reaction to it after Waterloo. Once Napoleon was dethroned, thanks to the joint victories of the English, Portuguese and Spanish soldiers in the west and the Russian victory in the East Front, the restored Bourbons in Versailles started pondering the best ways to take advantage of the Spanish Atlantic crisis. For one of the leading experts in the field, Rafe Bloffart, there were good reasons for France to intervene. The French government hoped to profit from the troubles of Spanish America, and like the other countries in the so-called Western Question, saw Britain as its main obstacle. Although much had been made of the French Bourbons' commitments to the principle of legitimacy, the relatively moderate Richelieu minister and his diplomatic agents were never completely hamstrung by the constraints of conservative ideology. For one thing, the defeat of Napoleon and the Bourbon restoration didn't diminish French Anglophobia. Well aware of those feelings, while preparing his military campaign against New Spain in London, tireless Mariano Renovales approached in 1818 the French government too. According to Bluffard, Renovales promised he would install a French monarchy in Mexico and grant French traders a 50% reduction on tariffs. He also offered the royal family political asylum in Mexico in case of revolution should break out in France. The foreign officer, Richelieu, was impressed and accepted to receive further details of Renovales' plan. In his view, the plan was ideal, for it didn't involve either a republic nor a Bonaparte. In his letter, Renovales reassured them that the revolution would put an end to Spanish domination, but wouldn't simply imply social change or radical reforms. All will be the same after the invasion, he said. Richelieu, however, started having doubts about the generals and his plans during the negotiation process. In their correspondence in the spring of 1818, growing anxiety and demands transpired this feeling of diffidence and confessed the former Spanish general was little more than a charlatan. At this point, Renovales added unbearable pressure to the French cabinet when he requested 200,000 francs in advance payment in exchange for the commercial profit France would surely be making. Richelieu had enough and close break off the deal by saying something of his conduct stink of the adventurer. The dealings with Renovales were not the first movements towards Latin America made by the conservative government of Louis XVIII. France had also made plans of invasion of Buenos Aires, with Colonel Moyen acting as a secret agent in the River Plate. Moyen, however, was disavowed in early 1818 when he suggested the Argentine government the candidacy of the unappointable Duke of Orleans as a potential king, but was somehow put off by the British failure. However, slave illegal trade with the insurgent colonies throughout the Danish-controlled island of Santo Tomás was key for the French government operations in the Caribbean. As the Spanish informants working in Paris told the Spanish Foreign Office, the Secretary of State and the Consul at Bogotá, French ships were not only engaged in smuggling all kinds of supplies and commodities in Hispanic America since the previous decades, but more worryingly, they also transported revolutionary books, leaders and weapons to overthrow the viceroyalties of Mexico and Colombia, Nueva Granada. Moreover, despite official abolition and strict control, ships under Spanish flag were also engaged in slave trade from French ports. At the end of the day, the trade race for Latin America was at the center of the concerns of both French and British diplomatic and commercial decision makers. Commercial hegemony indeed was the shared objective. Once freed from the exclusivist trade regulations of the Spanish monarchy, the new nations would adopt the fine-sounding policy of comercio libre. France would need to make all efforts to avoid British domination of the emancipated markets in an attempt to recover international power and reputation after the turmoil brought about by both the revolution and the defeated empire. Closely monitored by the Spanish authorities both in Cuba and the US, Renovales arrived in New Orleans in October 1818. According to the correspondence with the Captain General in Cuba, Renovales had led this expedition there and was about to set a training camps in the southern states of the US as Mina had done before him. However, the intendant informed that the former Spanish general was about to commit treachery against their supporters. On the 22nd of October, he told the Captain General of the existence of a secret treaty signed by both Renovales and the Spanish ambassador in London, the Duke of San Carlos, to give himself away to the Spanish authorities and fight against the insurgents at the service of the Ferdinand from within those circles. In connection with the ambassador of the US, Luis Dionís, an able diplomat and close friend of Ferdinand VII, with whom he had been to Bayonne during the French invasion of Spain, Renovales was prompted to go to Cuba and collaborate with the Captain General, Juan María Echeverri. However, in his journey from New Orleans to Havana, Renovales was accused of subversion due to the 17 pages long letter he had sent to the king condemning his decision of having sold Louisiana and Florida to the US government via the Onís-Adams Treaty, signed in February 1819. Upon his arrival, he would be sent to jail, where he died 1 year later. The official cause of death was yellow fever, although some historians, such as Ortuño, believe Echeverry's men probably poisoned him. Well, as preliminary conclusions, it could be first argued that this imperial crisis that broke out in 1808 led to more than an Atlantic Hispanic civil war, as put by Jaime Rodriguez. The sheer size of the empire, the intertwined nature of the domestic and international dimensions of the crisis entail a range of political actors and factors way beyond the crown's control. Secondly, the European powers did their best to take advantage of the situation and reach El Dorado to put it at their own service. British political and economic elites used a host of means to do so. They sent troops, volunteers, pirates, traders, commercial agents and spies to place themselves in a strong position to negotiate with the insurgent authorities. All these initiatives, however, needed to be conducted in secrecy due to the official alliance that linked Spain and Britain, and the former's stubborn reluctance to accept British mediation. France, as well as Russia, led a more erratic policy dictated by the Bourbon family agreements and put emphasis on lobbying the government in Madrid to foster and protect French interests in the Antilles and in the mainland Latin America. Finally, the US would be the first power to recognize Mexico, the United Provinces of River Plate and Gran Colombia in 1822. In 1824, Britain, following the lead of Foreign Minister George Canning, would follow suit. For the likes of Mina and Renovales, the 1820s proved to be a period when, in order to secure the just won independence, the acts of bravery in the battlefields needed to be complemented with smart diplomatic and political moves in the cabinets and saloons of Paris, Madrid, Moscow, London and Washington. And just two notes to close this intervention. First of all, we need to bear in mind the two economic crashes that took place during this period. One in 1809 and the second one, and more important, in 1825. The book resonated in New York in 1826. This first economic panic resembled actual dealings in the sense of not only the idea of investing in Latin America and minor speculation by investors led to those crises, but as shown by Flor Estrada in the day, the lack of specie or gold and silver in the Western markets account for it. And as Somaribia has recently showed, unethical business conduct by trade agents such as the Gordon and Murphy houses based in London account for the economic crisis. And secondly, Renovales wasn't in this annus horribilis of 1818, wasn't only expected in Cuba or in Mexico, he was also expected in the peninsula. And if you go and read the Secretary of State papers in Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, what you find is that an invasion of Biscay was also expected. And it was so important that the police, related to the Secretary of the State, displayed 3,000 men in the Cantábrico region in order to stop Renovales taking over. Thank you, sir.